Alex O'Connor spent a lot of time saying there's contradictions in the Gospels. My response is, so what? He doesn't believe in objective morality. He's a self-professed emotivist. Moral statements are just emotional gushes. Yes, other religions can make some changes, but there's nothing like the radical transformation that takes place when someone gets born again.
This is Provoke Inspire, where everything we do is to help you follow Jesus more faithfully in a broken world. Today, I got to talk to Greg Koukl. Recently, he spent over 5 hours on one of the world's biggest podcasts, The Diary of a CEO with Steven Bartlett, alongside atheist thinker Alex O'Connor and Harvard-trained psychiatrist Dr. K. These three men aren't just interesting public figures. They represent people in your life. The confident skeptic who's thought more about this than most Christians have. The successful friend who has everything and knows it's not enough. Or the spiritual but not religious person who believes in something, just nothing you can seem to pin down. Greg modeled how to communicate truth in a clear and respectful way. And if you've ever walked away from a conversation like this wishing you'd known what to say, this episode is for you. You are on one of the biggest platforms, podcasts in the world, The Diary of a CEO. What was that experience like for you?
I was happy with all the edits. I thought the team there, the post-production team, was really fair, and there were some good things I thought that ended up on the cutting room floor that I had said, but there are other stuff too that probably could have been left out. This is a fairly friendly environment. It's not supposed to be combative. In fact, when I had my pre-interviews, and there were 2 of them before I kind of made my way to the program proper, they were concerned that this not be a combative environment. And I said, I don't approach these things as gladiator events. I think this is a mistake for Christians to do that. A lot of non-Christians do it. They're looking for mic drop moments. They're looking for, clickbait stuff, but that's not our view at Stand to Reason. And there are some Christians like that, and that's really unfortunate. They're just nasty and over-aggressive. So anyway, I was a little surprised when it turned out that Alex was quite aggressive with me. And it took a lot of my focus or attention or concentration, I guess is what I'd have to say, just to be able to be careful that I didn't get squeezed into a corner. And in all these, there's a kind of a gamesmanship that goes on. Now, Steven was fabulous. And he's the open guy, trying to field the information. I do think he's genuinely open, and increasingly so. And even though Steven was asking the questions, all 3 were responding. And this is supposed to be about one issue, meaning and significance. Is there meaning and purpose in the world? And in my view, and this is strategically how I wanted to play this out, you have one of 2 choices. There either is or isn't. And if there is meaning and significance, you have to have something above that provides that. Right. If there is no God, if it's just molecules clashing in the universe, is the way I characterize it, and that's the alternatives, then there is no meaning. At one point, and something I admired about Alex O'Connor, he is somewhat transparent, and even-handed. He went after me pretty aggressively on some theological points, but when he was asked by Steven, hey, if somebody asked you, what would you how would you help them if they said, I don't have any meaning and purpose in life? Right. What would you say? And it was almost like he said, well, I'm an atheist. What do I know? Read the Bible, go to church, take drugs, read a book on philosophy. In other words, a very utilitarian approach, which is the same way that Dr. K approached it. In all of his kind of New Agey, Hindu, Buddhist stuff, psychiatric stuff that he had all blended together, basically is just saying, I'm going to provide a way to help people feel better without providing an answer to the question. I wanted to focus on the question. And because I think that and I did say this, I said, what Augustine said, Lord, you have made us for yourself. And our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. And Steven, you just read those statistics about people who feel restless and we're all here to talk about it because of our restlessness. This is an indication there is an answer to this question, that there is meaning, there is purpose. And I talked about C.S. Lewis's argument from desire, kind of along that line. But as you know, if you've seen the whole broadcast, which some people told me it was a bit tedious, and I agree, because of some of the directions it went that I thought were not helpful in the topic. It was so many, there were so many sidebars that were unrelated to that issue that I honestly didn't know what to say about some of it. And a lot of it had to do with all of the variety of stuff that Dr. K was kind of bringing onto the table that was very hard to organize and make sense of. A very nice guy, and certainly not going after anybody. He was complimentary to everybody on the table, so that wasn't a problem. But I think what he offered created confusion regarding the issue. I was happy for the way things went. When you do these things, you always look back and say, coulda, woulda, shoulda kind of thing. Fog of war. Who was it? Mike Tyson said that you always have a game. Everybody's got a game plan until they get punched in the mouth. You know. Right. So that's what happens in these circumstances. I had a game plan, and I had worked things out with my team, and we got prayed up and all that other stuff. But then when you get in the midst of it, things happen that you just have to deal with as they come. And let the Lord do what He wants to do through it. So it was a mixture of satisfaction and frustration, if I put it simply.
You did fantastic, honestly, and frankly, the environment was very challenging. I'm not trying to be critical of Dr. K in any way, but it felt at times, without getting too myopic on the actual conversation, people can of course go check that out. But it did feel like he wanted to insert himself into the conversation, right? He'd come from a long way, assumably, to be there. But it felt like in so doing, it kind of took the conversation somewhere that neither you nor Alex knew how to navigate, and you had to kind of pull the whole thing back together. So it is what it is. It's a challenge. But what I was saying before we started...
By the way, let me just say, Ben, please. That's a good example of real life. Because in real life, whether you're on a camera or you're just at Starbucks or wherever, you never know where it's going to go, and you kind of bone up as best you can for engagements like this with your own study and stuff like that, and then you follow the circumstances. You just take what the Lord gives you. Right. And then trust that He is going to use it as you're seeking to be faithful in the moment.
And I love that you went there, because that's what I was going to say, is that for those listening and trying to understand the framing here, as I was listening to that, I was struck by the idea that in many ways it represented the kinds of people that are in all of our lives and the kinds of chaos that we all face when trying to have these conversations. And so whether you have Steven, who was moderating but still contributed on some level as someone who I would say is maybe the least intellectual of everyone, but just a very driven guy, a very honest, open guy who's he has achieved so many things, but what's next? And you have Alex O'Connor, the brilliant atheist, who seems to represent this weird, confusing character in the sense that he seems close on some levels and then millions of miles away on another level. And then Dr. K, as we've already said, is just very hard to pin down and understand. And so what I thought would be cool is to just try to understand each of their characters so that somebody listening can say, oh, I totally get it. I have that kind of person in my life. Through the lens of your experience in that moment, I think you could offer a lot of insight. And so maybe to start, you said that meaning, as is evident from the conversation, meaning was sort of supposed to be the main point. Where do we derive meaning? Was that coming largely from Steven? Do you feel like that was a personal, a topic derived from a personal angst he has? And because I feel like I've heard shades of that coming out in other interviews he's had, and his friend in Dubai that he references. Did you feel like that was a very personal question?
I do think it's genuine in his case, and especially after watching the interview with Wes. I think he is really grappling. A difficulty for him is that there is a lot of noise in his life. There is a lot of noise. In other words, all kinds of people from all kinds of directions. I mean, just in the one hand, we'll talk maybe about Dr. K in a few moments, but just coming from Dr. K, that was so much noise that, in other words, okay, all of this mental traffic that he's got to separate out, he's got to separate the wheat from the chaff. And I'm just saying, there was a ton of chaff there in my view. And I don't know that he had the ability to separate that out, especially when he is he's kind of being buttered up a bit, by Dr. K. And actually, each of us were. He was complimentary to everybody, which is a nice thing, but there's also some gamesmanship, in my view, that was involved there. So I would take Steven as being a genuine person in this, and I think increasingly so. He had Wes Huff on.
Right.
I mean, that's meaningful. And incidentally, you have made reference to this with Steven. He is extremely successful. Yeah. When you look at, how the podcast world works, if you've got 12 million subscribers, you are. He was offered. I read this in Forbes magazine, 100 million for his show, and he turned it down. He said, "I can do better on my own." Now, this is interesting, though, because from worldly perspectives, here's a young man who's nice looking, who is exceptionally successful, and his operation is magnificently professional. These people are great, okay? And he's asking, what's it all about, Alfie? Right? Well, that's a song from the 60s. Sorry about that. I should have given you a warning. I do that once in a while. And he's asking these questions because he realizes that that's not the answer. And sometimes it's like, well, the young people are asking, but I know he's asking that question too. And so that speaks well of him. And, I pray for him. I think I prayed for him this morning, actually. And I pray that I could be back on the show to give him more of the truth in a thoughtful manner.
He's young, but he represents the, getting your life all in order and the entrepreneur and the success and the businesses, and he's attractive and all those. He represents what I think so many young people want. And yet you can already see that not only in himself, but among his peers, there is the existential restlessness and a wondering of, is there more to life than this? And so hypothesizing or Lord willing, the next time you have that one-on-one, how do you get through to a guy who clearly seems to be asking the right questions? And yet it feels like, even similarly, maybe with different, but similar to a Joe Rogan or a Jordan Peterson, there almost seems to be a popularization of the quest, but there seems to be a wall that it hits in terms of. And it's different, certainly, for each of them. What do you say to confront that? What needs to take place in a guy's life like that to really come to grips with reality?
Right. There are two things going on here, Ben. One of them is, how do I posture and how do I navigate strategically with what I know about him? And so in my own mind, I have a sense how I do that. I'll tell you in just a moment. But the wall, you can't do anything about the wall. That's something the Holy Spirit's got to deal with. Right. Because not to be over pietistic here, but it's just the reality, the circumstance. There are so many barriers. I mean, just think of the spiritual, for lack of a better word, the satanic barrier. Some people might cringe when I say that, but look, John says the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. That's 1 John 5. Okay. Paul writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy, the end of chapter 2, he says that the world has been held captive by him to do his will. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, he says that the devil has blinded the minds of the unbeliever. So, I mean, just thinking of that element. Now, the world, the flesh, and the devil, First John talks about that. So that's just the devil part. Yeah. That is an element in this engagement, in any engagement with people, okay? Then you got the flesh, all the things that the flesh is drawing away from. So this is what we are up against, is an insurmountable barrier in human terms. When you think of the terminology, the phraseology of the text regarding what I just quoted, the devil's control, we can't get through that. Only God can get through it. But our task is not to worry about that, frankly. We can pray about that, but that's praying to get him moving, to get God moving on our behalf with those people. Our job is to communicate clearly, graciously, and truthfully, and persuasively as possible. That's it. I just say 100% God, 100% man. It's kind of it's a takeoff on the Chalcedonian formula of Christology. Jesus, 100% God. But I mean it now in terms of sanctification, also ministry, that God's responsible 100% for his part. Right. And we are responsible for 100% of our part.
Right.
So we have something to do. It's not all of God and none of me. He has entrusted us with gifts and capabilities and opportunities and all that. And then when it gets to the wall, that's his problem, not mine. Nothing we can do about that. But when it comes to my part, if I were to sit down with Steven, I would want to make 2 points. I want to focus on the reasons why we are convinced. I don't like the word believe because it's too easy for non-believers to relativize that language, okay? The reason why we are convinced that God exists and that Jesus is God in flesh on the earth, okay? And that has to do with the reasons for God and historical evidence from the New Testament. I do not argue for the inerrancy of Scripture with non-Christians. It's a waste of time.
Yeah.
And Alex O'Connor has spent a lot of time saying there's contradictions in the Gospels. My response is, so what? That doesn't mean you can't have trustworthy history, and that's what we want to trade on. And so I'd want to talk about that element and answer questions, because I have a broad conviction here, and your viewers might find this helpful. And that is that when my daughter was, 8 years old, she asked me, Papa, how do we know that God is true? I thought about it for a moment because I'm trying to put this in words that would make sense to her. And the thoughts that came to my mind was, and this is what I said to her, the reason that we believe God is true is because he's the best explanation for the way things are. He's the best explanation for the way things are. Now, this covers the existence of the universe, the appearance of design, morality in the universe, the problem of evil, all of these things, and many, many more. The details of Jesus' life, the resurrection. It's the best explanation, what we hold. There's no better explanation. You can come up with ad hoc things that try to explain away, and this is what Alex O'Connor kept doing, waving the wand of evolution. And but it's not going to be adequate. This is and so I want to focus on that. I want him to get the substantive stuff that he could get his teeth into without distraction from other people. He's got that already. He's talked to all these other people. He can weigh what I'd have to say in light of all of that. But if I'm in a one-on-one conversation, and so I'm talking about Steven now, but this is, I know you're thinking more expansively as people are engaging other people. This is what that's a central part. They have to have a conviction that this is actually true. That what we're providing is not our truth, but facts about history and facts about the nature of reality. Okay. Yeah. But the second element, and this is also really, really important, especially I think with Steven, is what I referred to earlier as the existential element. Now, the existential element is not the external fact stuff, it's the internal hungers, the internal yearnings, the internal desire for meaning and significance, which is what that show was supposedly about, and the internal hunger for forgiveness. And I would want to speak to that. The way Christians sometimes will say it is, well, we're all sinners, and Jesus is the only way because, he died for you. And I shouldn't, those are all really profoundly true. But when people hear that, I think it's religious noise to them. Yeah. And I think we have to find different ways of expressing it. And so, for example, if I were addressing this particular point with Steven, I would say, Steven, let me ask you a question. Have you ever felt guilty?
Yeah.
Yeah. He says, I try to do good. I try to do all these things. He said that on the air. I try to do the best I can. He told that to Wes, too. And I said, I can just ask him this question. Do you ever feel guilty? Yeah. Everybody's felt guilty, right? Okay, why? Why do you feel guilty? Now, I want him to answer. The tactical approach. I'm asking questions, right? In this case, I'd want Steven to respond because I know he's going to say yes, that he has feel guilty because he's a human being made in the image of God. Okay, that's a safe question. And then I'm going to ask why. Now, what I'm getting at, and I think I can get to this point fairly quickly, you feel guilty because you are guilty. It's not artificial. You know that deep in your heart. Okay, and the answer to guilt is not denial. The answer to guilt is forgiveness. I think that goes like an arrow right directly to the heart of the matter of the exorcist. People want forgiveness. That's the answer, forgiveness. You can't undo the past. You cannot do that. It's done with. You are standing there in the dock and you're guilty. And eventually the books are going to be opened. And every single thing that anybody has ever done wrong is right there. That's Revelation 20. He's making a list and he's checking it twice. Now what? And what's not in there is all your good stuff, because that doesn't matter. You're supposed to do that already. You don't get credit for that against your bad stuff. Law doesn't work that way. You can't, you're not going to get a letter from the DA, saying, hey, I checked the records. You haven't committed any crimes in the last 10 years. Go out and knock off a few gas stations on us. You have credit in your account, right? It doesn't work that way. It's the bad stuff that sinks our ship, and that's what the final judgment is about. Now what? The answer is forgiveness. And this is where Jesus comes in. And so what I'm trying to do is take the heart of the gospel and attach it to that existential hunger and desire that everybody has. And so I have and this I'm offering to you and to your viewers that as a two-pronged approach. Sometimes as apologists, guys like me, we want to do the first part, get to the facts and all that, and that's important. Sometimes, though, it's almost better, depending on the individual, sometimes just going straight to the existential issue, straight to the heart. You know what you need? You need forgiveness. That's what you need. And that's what Jesus can get you. A line like that. And sometimes that can turn everything around completely, especially if you've offered some credible reasons to think that this whole enterprise is actually true.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think as I was listening to this and, participating in my own way, kind of talking back to the podcast, so to speak, I think why a conversation like this gets stuck in the mud is because if it's just a matter of what gives you a sense of meaning or a psychological sense of happiness or whatever, then yeah, you can kind of see that being derived from a lot of different places. Kind of like Alex humorously said, drugs or church or reading a book or whatever. You can see how that would give you a sense of meaning or even bring some sort of change. Even Steven alluded to, well, don't all religions kind of do the same thing? But I think such a necessary pivot, and I feel like you're saying this, is that ultimately Jesus didn't come just to give you meaning or a psychological sense of happiness. He came to forgive you. He came to take what was dead and make it alive. And so that's really where this conversation has to center, because you could see how if it's just about what gives you a psychological sense of meaning or happiness, then yeah, try different things. And it's even kind of a nice copacetic conversation, because whatever works for you is good, whatever works for me is good. It fits rather within this sort of pluralistic framework. But Jesus, he confronts something, doesn't he? Because with Jesus, you kind of have a decision to make. It's not just about how he makes you feel. It's about what you're going to do with what he did, what he says about reality and who you are, and the way that he confronts sin and requires a decision from us.
I have a little wrinkle I want to add to that. It's really well said, Ben. But this is where this question about have you ever felt guilty is an attempt to get them to reveal their own awareness of their own sinfulness, not me calling them a sinner. And so this is a little tactical twist. We can call them sinners, and that's just, and there's times where that's appropriate. I mean, Jesus did that at different times, but I'm just saying tactically, if we can ask a question that gets them if you've provided a reasonably safe environment for this, in the manner in which you're engaging, you're nice, to them, they will acknowledge what's true, and you don't have to, in a certain sense, tell them a sinner. Everybody knows they're a sinner because they are made in the image of God and they're fallen. Okay, and this goes to the wrinkle too. It isn't that Jesus, the way I would argue this, it isn't that Jesus came to give you meaning. Jesus came because you already have meaning. You have meaning because the way God made you in the image of God. And you know this. Human beings have an intuitive sense of this, that there's something special about human beings, and it's reflected in our language and our behavior and all kinds of things. Now, we don't always live consistently with that, but it's internal knowledge that we have because being made in the image of God. Okay, so and Jesus doesn't die for junk. It isn't like his death makes you valuable. You are valuable. It's interesting. Peter has this line in 1 Peter. It says, you have not been redeemed with silver and gold and junk like that. but rather with the precious blood of Christ. So the price that Jesus paid for us is an indication of the value we already have. And that was a point I wanted to work on in that conversation, but there were a lot of distractions. We know we have meaning and purpose. The question is, what is the grounding of that? It certainly is in Eastern religions. That's all over the map, and ultimately, you don't have durability. And as your identity, yourself, you go to heaven. Not in Hinduism, you disappear in Hinduism. In Buddhism, you disappear. That's heaven. We disappear, So it's we disappear into the Godhead or whatever, kind of thing. But it's Christianity provides something entirely different. What our hearts yearn for, forgiveness and relationship that is reliable, and it's not dependent on us. There's safety because we're not the ones keeping ourselves saved. It is Jesus that is able to do that, and he does do that. And that's what gives us a sense of safety. And when Steven was offering, lots of religions change life, I'm not sure how much of this I addressed. But the fact is, if I were one-on-one, I pressed, I said, this isn't true. Yes, other religions can make some changes, but there's nothing, I promise you, there's nothing like the radical transformation that takes place consistently, persistently, universally, regardless of time or culture, as when someone gets born again. They get regenerated. Their lives are different. Think of all the Muslims who are willing to change to Christianity, even though they know in the place that they live, this puts their life in danger. Their families will throw them out, And anyway, so it's not the same. You could join a club, you could whatever, and your life will be changed in some measure. But nothing like what we're talking about here. There's no comparison. That's what I would want to argue with Steven.
Yeah, I mean, I could see how even with these other religions and worldviews, because you are looking at a transcendent source of meaning and hope and morality, that affords you some grounding, right? Other than the nihilist who has to say, well, nothing really matters and everything's an accident. Whatever the transcendent belief is, it will give you some of that existential stability. But again, where it falls short is that only in Jesus do we have not only that transcendence, but we have this unearned sense of love and value, the image of God, the idea that I could be fully known for all of who I am and still loved, right? That I can't earn it. It's not about hustle or deep thinking or meditation or all of these other practices that you hear espoused by these guys and on Steven's podcast often. But it's simply a submitting to the reality of who God is, who I am, and how he can love me despite earning it. And that is what our soul longs for more than anything. And yeah, I really hope that Steven can find that truth.
We get rescued. We can't rescue ourselves. God rescues us. That's our story. Every other story, we're trying to rescue ourselves, and we're hoping to try to rescue ourselves. And by the way, that mentality seeps into Christianity too, of people that are just thinking, I just got to do in order to get saved or keep saved. And of course, behavior is really important to God, but the context is entirely different when you belong to him and you're on the inside of his family based on grace. That changes everything.
So just to switch gears for a little bit, and I promise this won't be a 5-hour marathon like you had with Steven Bartlett, but, Alex O'Connor is someone who's been on my heart for a long time because in many ways he represents what I think is kind of the evolution of the new atheist, right? He was very young, still is very young, but when that whole rise of new atheists, with Dawkins and Dennett and Hitchens, he was kind of this young, precocious YouTuber who was espousing a lot of what they were saying. But then as that whole thing kind of faded, he evolved and, he's still very much what I would consider an atheist. He calls himself a non-resistant non-believer, but it doesn't carry with it the same hostility, the same condescending, caustic tones that you really saw with the rise of the new atheists.
There was with me, though some told me that they've watched almost everything he's ever done and they had not seen him as aggressive with someone. as he was with me. He wasn't that way with John Lennox, for example. He was very deferential.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think the irony with him is that while I think he wants to remain very distant from the idea of objective morality, right? You pointed that out. I think this conversation really struck a nerve with him. I don't think he probably planned on getting as heated as he did. Of course, I can't know exactly what he was thinking. But despite his idea of sort of moral pragmatism and not believing in any sort of objective moral truth, for whatever reason, the idea of animal suffering really seems to hit him deep. It seems to really strike a nerve. And I think from my vantage point, that's kind of what happened here. He, started talking about a passionate subject, something that he cares deeply about. And so I think that's where this sort of aggressive tone seemed to emerge from.
But this was a point that I always want to make with people like him, is the grounding question. How is it? Okay, so he doesn't have morality. He's a motivist. And it might have been helpful just to said, Alex, I know this bothers you. You explain to me, based on your worldview and your understanding of morality, why anyone should care what you think about animal suffering. There it is. Because he would have nothing, I think, useful to say. I didn't ask it quite like that. I did accuse him of smuggling morality into this question. He really reacted to that. I have never mentioned morality once. So, of course, that's why you call it smuggling. You're slipping it in there, and it was so evident to me and most people who were watching that was the case. But this is. I think that what I like about Alex, I don't know if he's close or not. I mean, he is willing to acknowledge the cracks in his armor. Consciousness mystifies him. There's no place in a materialistic worldview for consciousness. He doesn't know what to do with it. And now he's thinking of panpsychism. This is so silly. What the heck? What's wrong with mind-body dualism, which is so obvious? Which you've got a mind, a soul, and you've got a body. But you've got an immaterial self. That's where your thoughts and your desires and acts of will and feelings, all that, that's such a straightforward answer that comports with all of our intuitions. He doesn't want to go there because there's theistic implications to that. So he's now flirting with panpsychism, which, geez, that really made Dr. K happy. He's flipping out over there about that one. But he'll acknowledge that, the problem with consciousness. And he doesn't seem to be bothered at all about his moral non-realism. He doesn't believe in objective morality. He's a self-professed emotivist. Moral statements are just emotional gushes. That's all it is. They don't even have propositional content. If I say something like rape is wrong, I'm not saying anything about rape or being wrong, because wrong has no meaning. I'm saying, oh, rape, ick. My response. So, he doesn't seem to doubt that at all. Like, he doesn't seem to be wondering, well, maybe there is objective morality. That amazes me, especially with his concern about suffering, because he was pressing me on that point about suffering quite a bit, actually, and trying to embarrass me, I think. He characterized my own view, the Christian view, in the most uncharitable way imaginable. So that was a rough spot to get out of for me. But the irony is that he has nothing better to offer because he doesn't even think suffering is morally suspect. Yet here he is reacting this way, as if there's some substance to his response and it invades against theism of some sort. So I admire him for his transparency and his willingness to acknowledge that there's some evidence for the resurrection. Something happened right around 33, right in that period of time, at that part of the world, that created an explosion that we know as Christianity. Something happened. He acknowledges that. So, it's hard to tell where he's going to go from here. And, he's I don't mean this in a condescending way at all, but he's just a kid. This is deceptive when you listen to him. He's 26 years old. That's young. Okay. And so he's got a lot of years to be thinking and to be maturing and, as you said, evolving in a sense from the new atheism and the harshness and that, I think, intellectual shallowness of those views to something more robust and something more thoughtful. And I think as time goes on, that may serve him well. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, often when I think about these conversations around justice and morality, and people can have these very cold academic ideas like emotivism, as you described it, without knowing the details of his life. And I don't want to be too presumptuous here, but my assumption is he probably hasn't suffered very much. He hasn't really faced the hardships of life. And I know I haven't. I don't feel like I've endured anything like what you read of in history or what's experiencing in the world now. And it feels like you can kind of have these very, pithy philosophical ideas about morality when morality is just a theory, when you have not suffered, you have not experienced the bitter suffering of injustice in your own life. And so how much of this do you think is just that he hasn't probably suffered very much? Of course, not that I want him to or wish that upon anyone.
No. Well, if that's the price for eternity, it's certainly worth paying. And ironically, there was a feature of that in my own life when I had left my kind of quasi-religious or somewhat religious upbringing, and when I was a teenager in the 60s, and then, embraced the whole, worldly deal. What happened is things were going really great for me. And then, because of a broken relationship that was really, really hard for me, I had to face the reality of my own philosophies and their inadequacy to help me in this time. I called it cosmic alienation because that was it. I mean, there's nobody here, no one in the world, no in the universe that knows or cares or whatever ultimately for me. And that didn't lead me to Christ, but it really showed me the depth of, or the inadequacy of the conglomeration of philosophies I had stuck together that made me feel good when I was feeling good. Then those things changed. Here's another liability, though, that Alex is facing. Alex is a very successful podcaster as an atheist. He hasn't written a book yet. He's planning to do it, but it doesn't matter. He's in print. He's public with all of his views. When you get in print, whether literally in a book or virtually, in a major way, he's got over 1 million subscribers, I think, to his enterprise. It's very hard to change your view. So much more is at stake when you change your view. So I don't know, economically for him, he'd probably still do well as a podcaster, but that's got to be a consideration for one. Maybe in the back of his, I don't know, in his mind, but I'm just saying this makes things harder. I think that he'll gather a good following as a Christian podcaster if he were to make that move. But it's just psychologically harder to say I was mistaken. It's very hard to do, especially when you've been very public about your convictions. It's not impossible. Look at Saul of Tarsus. And many others like him. Even nowadays, we have people that have been very public and have changed their mind, turned not quite on a dime, but nevertheless still. But I think it's a liability for him, something to think about.
So just trying to close here, kind of looking at these three guys, and I know I didn't address Dr. K very much. As we have said a lot, he was pretty hard to pin down. But for someone listening, I'm sure they have someone in mind who fits into one of these camps, right? Either they're the kind of new ageist, spiritual, open, kind of everything is true, nothing is true, kind of very hard to pin down, or they're the Alex O'Connor, right? Bright and intellectual, claim on some levels to be open to God, but have a lot of ideas and objections. Or like Steven, who, I think he maybe represents just more your average person. He wants to make the most of his life. He wants to be a good person. He's wondering what is true. He's achieved a lot of the promises of culture, and I think he's maybe feeling some of the emptiness of it as well. For those listening who maybe fit or have people who fit into one of these camps, what kind of last words of wisdom would you offer them? Guidance would you give them to approach this person in their life with the hope of Jesus?
Mm-hmm. Well, largely the appeal from culture, and certainly this came through, I think, from Dr. K, is a utilitarian approach where you find some things that help you feel satisfied, fulfilled, help you feel like you have value. okay, this is the wrong approach. Because, well, let me back up. If there is no meaning of any sort, then all you're left with is making your own meaning, and you do your best with that. Okay, but that's nihilistic, and that's like nothingism, right? And so you make peace with nothingism, and you find your path. But in that regard, any path is going to be any path. No, there's no distinctions between the paths morally. So you could be a Mother Teresa, you can be an Adolf Hitler, a Idi Amin, or a sex slave trader, or whatever. You can't qualify one as better than the other, except for in the way it just satisfies you. That's what you're left with. Now, I think people know better. I think, and Francis Schaeffer made this point many years ago, every human being is made in the image of God. And they can't get away from that. There are things that are built in. They live in the world that God made. And in the tactics book, I have a chapter called Inside Out, and I trade on this notion. And the last line in that chapter is they can run from God, but they can't run from themselves. And so what I try to do is trade on things that people deep down know to be the case, and do that. And so if there are people thinking about these things, this is what you have to. You want to know what's true about the world. Now, if it turns out that Christianity is true, this is not going to be an easy life for you if you decide to follow Jesus. It is not going to be. It's going to be hard, because now we're on the inside of the family, and God's going to train us up, discipline us, and make us more like Jesus. That's the goal. He's got the long view, not the short view. It's satisfying and fulfilling, but it's also hard and painful as God takes us through all kinds of stuff. And we never get over that. Your folks tell you the same story, and you know this because you have a long history with missions in your family, etc. It isn't like, okay, now I'm mature in the Lord and things get easy. No, they just get hard. They still stay hard because God, you're still distance to go. But my encouragement to people is, you want to find out what's true. Sooner or later, you're going to know that. And if it's Christianity, which I'm absolutely convinced is the case, when you find out that Christianity is true and it's too late, this is not a pretty picture. So that's when here's the simple calculus when I talk about the cross. Either Jesus pays or you pay. It's either perfect justice, punishment for everything you've ever done wrong and God misses nothing, or perfect mercy, which is forgiveness for everything you've ever done wrong, and God misses nothing. That's what's at stake.
Yeah, wow. Well, Greg, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a real privilege for me. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I know God's going to continue to use you like he already has. I'm so grateful for your voice on that particular conversation, but also just in general. So thank you. Thanks for letting us be part of your journey. I'll be cheering you on from afar like I do, and I hope we can do this again.
Thank you, Ben, and at your service. Anytime you'd like to chat, I'd love to chat with you again too.